The tavern at the harbor had seen its share of strange characters, but none as unsettling as old Jonas. With a weathered face like driftwood and eyes clouded by years at sea, he commanded an eerie respect among the fishermen. They said he'd survived storms that swallowed entire crews, storms no man should have come back from. Tonight he sat in his usual spot by the fire, hands clasped around a chipped mug of rum, the flickering light casting deep shadows across his wrinkled skin. The young man sitting across from him shifted uneasily. Henry, a modest antique dealer new to the port town, wasn't sure why he'd allowed himself to be coaxed into a drink with the old sailor. Jonas had been watching him from the moment he'd stepped into the tavern, and when their eyes met, it was as if something passed between them. A silent invitation, or a warning. "So you're the one who bought that old shop down on Weaver's Row?" Jonas rasped, his voice thick with the sea's salt and sand. "Heard you're looking for oddities." Henry nodded, though he wasn't sure he liked where the conversation was heading. There was something unsettling about Jonas's gaze, how it seemed to peer through the present into something deeper, darker. Jonas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You ever hear of the Black Pearl?" Henry frowned. He had, but only in passing. It was a whispered name among sailors, something tied to ghost stories and superstitions. He chalked it up to sea folk tales, the kind of mythos that clung to coastal towns like this one. "The Black Pearl's not just some legend," Jonas said, as if reading his thoughts. "It's real. As real as the tides that pull at the shore. I've seen it with my own eyes." Henry leaned back in his chair, forcing a skeptical smile. "A black pearl? And what's so special about that?" Jonas's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "It's cursed, lad. Doomed to bring ruin to anyone foolish enough to possess it. I was part of the crew that found it years ago. We were after treasure diving near an old wreck out in the deep waters. Captain was obsessed with it, said there was gold down there. And what we found..." He trailed off, staring into his drink as if reliving the moment. "What you found?" Henry prompted, though his curiosity had now been overtaken by a growing unease. "A pearl, as black as night, lying in the mouth of a dead man's skull." Jonas's voice was barely above a whisper, as if even speaking of it was dangerous. "The captain took it, thought it was the greatest prize. But from the moment he touched it, things went wrong. The ship, it felt different, like something was watching us. Days later, the captain was dead, washed overboard, though the sea was calm that night." Henry shifted again, his heart beating a little faster. The fire seemed to crackle louder, the shadows in the room deepening as Jonas continued. One by one, the crew started dying. Accidents, illnesses, some went mad. We tried throwing it back into the sea, but it always returned. Found its way into someone's hands no matter how far we sailed. Jonas paused, the silence stretching. "The pearl wants to be owned, but it demands a price." Henry felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What happened to it?" Jonas chuckled, though it was humorless. "It's out there somewhere, waiting for the next poor soul to claim it. Some say it's found its way into collections, passed off as just another rare jewel, but it always finds its way back to the sea, dragging its victims with it." Henry couldn't tell if the old man was serious or just another victim of too many years at sea. But there was something about the way Jonas spoke, something about the gleam in his eye that left Henry with a lingering sense of dread. As the night wore on, Jonas rose to leave. Before he shuffled out into the foggy harbor night, he placed a weathered hand on Henry's shoulder his grip surprisingly firm. "You seem like a smart lad. If you ever come across the Black Pearl, remember my words. Some treasures are better left to the deep." The door swung shut behind Jonas, leaving Henry alone with the flickering fire and the cold weight of the sailor's warning. He couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Not for him. Days passed, but Henry couldn't shake the conversation with old Jonas. The Black Pearl's tale clung to him like sea mist, creeping into his thoughts as he worked. His antique shop, small and tucked between two crumbling buildings on Weaver's Row, was a quiet place. Too quiet lately. Foot traffic had slowed, and he spent most days dusting the shelves, cataloging old books, or polishing forgotten trinkets no one seemed to want. Yet Jonas's words gnawed at him, a strange undercurrent of tension flowing beneath his routine. It was late one evening, long after the sun had slipped behind the horizon, when Henry's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but business had been slow, so he answered. "Mr. Thorne?" a clipped, formal voice said on the other end. "Yes, speaking," Henry replied, sitting up in his chair, glancing out the window. The fog had rolled in again, thick and heavy over the streets. "I hear you deal in unusual items," the voice continued. "I have something you might find interesting. A pearl from a private collection." Henry's breath caught for a moment, the word pearl hanging in the air like a thread between him and the stranger. "A pearl?" he asked, his voice cautious. "What sort of pearl?" "Black, perfectly round. A remarkable specimen," the voice said. "I'd be willing to sell it to you for a fair price. If you're interested, that is." Henry hesitated. The logical part of his brain knew this was probably just coincidence, that his mind was too caught up in Jonas's tale. But there was something about the timing, the way this offer arrived out of nowhere, that made his skin prickle. "I'm interested," Henry said carefully. "Where did you say it came from?" "Best you not ask too many questions," the man replied, his tone suddenly colder. "Do you want it or not? I can bring it by tomorrow." Henry's curiosity, despite the warning that echoed in his mind, got the better of him. "All right. Tomorrow it is." The line went dead, leaving Henry in silence. He sat there for a while, staring at the phone in his hand, the unease settling into the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the pearl. It was the voice, the way the offer had come wrapped in shadows. That night, sleep didn't come easy. His dreams were vivid, filled with flickers of dark water and twisted faces just beneath the surface. He saw a hand reaching out from the depths, skeletal fingers grasping at something, pulling it down into the cold, endless sea. When he awoke, it was still dark outside, but something felt wrong. He lay there for a moment, heart pounding in the silence of his bedroom, listening. The house creaked in the wind, the floorboards shifting under unseen weight. But then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like water dripping. He sat up, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The noise continued, a soft plink, 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 like droplets falling onto wood. His gaze darted to the window. It wasn't raining. He swung his legs out of bed and padded quietly down the narrow hallway toward the front of the house, every creak of the old floorboards making his pulse race. As he reached the main room of the shop, the sound grew louder. His breath caught in his throat as he saw it. A small pool of water on the floor, rippling softly as if something had just disturbed it. His eyes tracked upward, and there it was, sitting on the counter, gleaming dully in the dim light. A pearl. Black, flawless, shimmering in the dark, He hadn't heard anyone come in. There'd been no knock, no creak of the door. But there it was, resting in the center of his shop as if it had always been there. Henry froze, staring at the object. His skin crawled with a feeling he couldn't quite place. A sensation that this wasn't just some random theft or prank. It felt as if the pearl had found him, chosen him. The air around it seemed to pulse, thick with tension. And for the briefest moment, Henry thought he saw something move in the reflection of its smooth surface. Something dark and cold, like the sea itself. He took a step back, his heart racing. The Black Pearl. It's real. He could almost hear old Jonas's voice whispering in his mind, warning him. But it was too late now. The pearl was here, and with it, something else. Something far more dangerous. As the night pressed in from the foggy streets outside, Henry realized he was no longer alone in his shop. The curse had found him. The following morning, Henry sat at his desk, the Black Pearl resting on a folded cloth in front of him. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on his mind, and he hadn't slept since. He tried to convince himself that it was all just his imagination, that the pearl hadn't really appeared out of nowhere. But the faint water stains on the floor, the lingering chill in the air, said otherwise. He stared at the pearl. Its surface was flawless, unnaturally smooth, with a strange sheen that seemed to ripple in the light. He reached out to touch it, but hesitated. Something about it repelled him, an instinctive warning he couldn't ignore. Instead, he pushed his chair back and grabbed the phone. He needed answers, and there was only one place to start: the past. Henry spent the rest of the morning combing through old records, newspapers, and maritime logs, hoping to find any mention of the Black Pearl. He found himself diving deeper into the history of the town's port, its shipping routes, and the sailors who had mysteriously vanished over the decades. It was like pulling at a loose thread, and soon the pieces began to unravel. There were records of ships lost at sea, all tied to a particular wreck, the Harbinger, a merchant vessel that had gone down more than a century ago, rumored to have been carrying untold treasures plundered from far-off lands. According to legend, the Harbinger had sailed into uncharted waters and never returned, though whispers among the sailors spoke of something darker, a curse that had claimed the crew long before the sea did. And then, buried deep in an archive of shipping manifests, Henry found it. A mention of the Black Pearl. The Harbinger's captain, William Marin, had recorded its discovery in his personal logbook, an artifact found in the wreckage of a much older ship, one that had no name, only the remnants of a forgotten empire. His hands trembled as he read the log entry. It was brief, almost careless, as if Marin had written it before truly understanding what he had found. We came upon a most curious item today, a pearl of the deepest black. It shines like the ocean at night, unsettling but beautiful. I've claimed it as my prize, though the men grow uneasy in its presence. Superstitious fools. The log ended abruptly after that. There were no more entries from Captain Marin, no explanation for what had happened to the Harbinger or its crew. But Henry knew. They had found the pearl, and like Jonas had said, it had claimed them. A shiver ran down his spine. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the pearl. It had been passed down through generations, leaving ruin in its wake, until now. And somehow, it had come to him. Henry stood and paced the room, feeling the weight of the pearl's dark history pressing in on him. He needed to know more, needed to understand how something so small could carry such dread. His mind raced through everything Jonas had told him, the fragments of the legend that now seemed far too real. There had to be others, Others who had encountered the pearl, who had faced its curse and lived to tell about it. Or perhaps more likely, died under its shadow. He spent the rest of the afternoon calling collectors, dealers, even a few historians, asking if they had heard of the Black Pearl. Most of them dismissed it as a sailor's myth, a tale spun from boredom and too much rum. But one voice, a soft and weathered one, responded differently. "There are things in this world, Mr. Thorne, that are better left forgotten," said an older woman, her voice barely a whisper on the line. "If you've come across that pearl, then I'm afraid you've already invited the darkness in." Henry swallowed hard. "Do you know what it is?" "I know enough. It has taken more lives than you can imagine. It haunts its keepers, lures them into madness and death. You cannot own it without consequence." His mouth went dry. "How do I stop it? How do I get rid of it?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so thick it felt like the world was holding its breath. "You don't," she said finally. "The pearl chooses its time. All you can do is hope it's not too late." The line clicked dead. Henry stood in the quiet of his shop, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. The shadows in the room seemed darker now, the air colder. He glanced again at the black pearl, sitting innocently on its cloth. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. Just for a moment, a fleeting glimpse. A figure, pale and dripping, standing at the edge of the room, watching him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the sound of water, faint and distant, echoing in his mind. The pearl had already begun its work. The days after that call blurred together in a haze of dread and sleeplessness. Henry felt as though he were sinking, deeper and deeper into the grip of something ancient and malevolent. The pearl sat on its cloth, unmoving, yet it seemed to pull at him, warping the air around it. He caught himself staring at it for long stretches of time, losing track of hours, his thoughts muddling in strange loops. The shop, usually a sanctuary of quiet solitude, began to feel suffocating. Shadows grew longer than they should, creeping up the walls as if they had minds of their own. The familiar creaks of the old building became unsettling, as though someone, or something, was pacing just beyond his sight. And then there were the whispers. Faint at first, like wind brushing through cracks, but growing louder each day. They filled the stillness, seeping into his thoughts, distorting his sense of reality. "Return it!" The voice would hiss from nowhere, a cold breath brushing against the back of his neck when he turned corners too quickly. Always it sounded as though it came from just behind him, but whenever Henry spun around, he found nothing but the empty room, the pearl gleaming dully in the center. It was driving him mad. He knew it, but he couldn't stop it. He'd even tried locking the pearl away, stuffing it into a small iron chest in the back of the shop. It did nothing. In fact, the moment he shut the lid, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. That night, he had dreamed of the ocean again, dark and bottomless, pulling him under, filling his lungs with cold water. By the third night, Henry could barely sleep. He lay awake in his bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable whispers to start again. His mind raced, skittering between panic and exhaustion. He thought of old Jonas, of his grim warning that some treasures were best left to the deep. He thought of the nameless woman on the phone, her chilling words still echoing. "You've already invited the darkness in." The thought that haunted him most, though, was the simple fact that the pearl had chosen him. Why? What was it about him, about this place, that had drawn it here? A loud crash from the shop below jolted Henry from his thoughts, sending a shock of adrenaline through his system. He jumped out of bed, heart hammering, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. For a moment he stood frozen at the top of the stairs, listening. Another noise, this time the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. He grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a heavy candlestick, and descended the stairs slowly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The shop was dark, save for the slivers of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the window shutters. He could hear the soft, wet sound of something moving. His heart pounded in his chest, the candle holder slick in his sweaty grip. When he reached the bottom step, his stomach dropped. The chest where he'd locked the pearl had been thrown open, its lid splintered and askew. The pearl lay in the middle of the floor, surrounded by shards of glass from a broken display case. But worse than that, so much worse, was the figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was a man, or what had once been a man. His clothes were tattered, soaked through as though he had just emerged from the ocean. His skin was pale with a bluish tint, bloated and swollen in places. Dark seaweed clung to his legs, and his eyes, milky and wide, were locked on Henry. Henry took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room with an unbearable cold, a damp chill that seemed to rise from the floor itself. "Leave it," the figure rasped, its voice a hollow echo like a distant cry carried on the wind. "Return it to the sea." Henry could barely breathe. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Instead, he watched in horror as the figure began to dissolve, its form disintegrating into misty tendrils of water, which pooled around the pearl before seeping into the floorboards. For a long moment, Henry stood there, trembling, trying to convince himself that it wasn't real, that it was all just some terrible hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But the cold, the broken glass, the lingering dampness, it was all too real. The curse was tightening its grip. Henry dropped the candlestick, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He knew now that this was beyond him. The pearl wasn't just haunted. It was a doorway, a conduit to something far darker, something that had waited in the depths for centuries. The whispers returned, clearer this time, almost conversational. It wants to go back. It always goes back. Henry stared at the pearl, shimmering innocently in the dim light, and realized with a sinking heart that it wasn't a question of whether he could return it to the sea. It was a question of whether he could survive long enough to try. The following evening, the fog rolled in thick over the town, shrouding the streets in a damp, suffocating gloom. Henry hadn't left his shop all day. He paced back and forth, his eyes constantly flicking to the black pearl sitting on the counter, now nestled in a velvet-lined box. He had tried everything to rid himself of it, locking it away, hiding it, even considering tossing it in the river. But he knew deep down that none of those options would work. The pearl had chosen him, and it would follow him wherever he went. He wasn't alone anymore. Every time he turned a corner, he felt the presence of something just behind him, hovering at the edge of his vision. Faint footsteps echoed through the shop, soft and squelching, like bare feet walking across wet ground. He had stopped looking over his shoulder because each time he did, the cold, bloated figures of the drowned ones stared back at him, their eyes hollow, skin pale and slick with seawater. They said nothing, only watched, waiting. The whispers, too, were growing louder, more persistent. They filled every silence, a chorus of voices that tugged at his sanity. "We are waiting. Waiting in the dark." Henry rubbed his temples, trying to push the voices out of his mind, but they wouldn't leave him. It was as if the Pearl's curse had wrapped itself around his thoughts, drawing him into its web. He was running out of time. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The old sea chest he had found at a nearby thrift market was still propped open in the corner of the shop, its wood swollen and warped from the damp air. Inside were scattered maps, worn and faded, but one caught Henry's eye. He pulled it out, spreading it across the counter. The map was old, far older than he had realized at first glance, marking forgotten shipping lanes and shipwrecks long lost to the deep. His eyes fell on a spot circled in faded ink off the coast, the place where the Harbinger had gone down, the place where the Black Pearl had first been claimed. The sea. The answer was there, just as the voices had said. He had to return the Pearl to the ocean, to the exact place where the curse had begun. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. Someone who understood the old ways. Someone who knew the sea as intimately as it knew him. His mind raced back to old Jonas. The sailor had warned him, tried to stop him from getting involved with the Pearl. But now Henry had no choice. Jonas was the only one who might know how to end this nightmare. It was late when Henry arrived at the crumbling house by the docks where Jonas lived. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways, carrying with it the tang of salt and decay. The door was unlocked, swinging slightly on its hinges, as though the old man had been expecting him. Inside, the house was dark, lit only by the dull glow of an oil lamp on a crooked table. Jonas sat hunched in a chair, his back to Henry, staring out of a grimy window at the harbor beyond. He didn't turn as Henry stepped inside. "You've seen them, haven't you?" Jonas rasped, his voice dry as paper. "The drowned ones. They come for all who hold the Pearl." Henry swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "I can't escape it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to return it to the sea. I have to end this." Jonas finally turned, his milky eyes locking onto Henry's. "The sea doesn't forget, lad. It never forgets what belongs to it." His gaze flicked to the box in Henry's hands, where the Black Pearl rested like a malignant heart. "That thing will drag you down just like it did the others. The Harbinger, the captain, all of them. They tried to keep it, just like you. But the sea takes what it's owed." Henry took a step closer, desperation leaking into his voice. "Then help me. Tell me what to do. How do I take it back?" Jonas let out a low, bitter laugh. "You don't take it back. You offer it. You return it like a supplicant. You find the place it came from and you give it up willingly. Otherwise..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Otherwise, you'll join the drowned." A chill ran through Henry, colder than the fog outside. He could feel the presence of the drowned ones even now, standing just beyond the door, watching, waiting. The weight of the Pearl seemed to grow heavier in his hand. "Take it to the water," Jonas said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Go before it's too late. But beware. It won't let you go so easily. It'll want to drag you with it." Henry nodded, a hollow feeling growing in his chest. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. The drowned were watching. The sea was waiting. And time was running out. As Henry left Jonas's house, the fog clung to him, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The Pearl pulsed in his hand like a living thing, and in the distance he could hear the faint sound of waves crashing against rocks. The sea was calling, and this time it would take what was owed. The sea was a vast black mirror as Henry stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, the salt wind whipping his face. Below him, the waves crashed against jagged rocks, white foam spraying into the air like ghostly hands reaching for him. In his hand, The black pearl pulsed, its cold surface seeming to vibrate with each roll of the tide. It was just past midnight, the moon obscured by heavy clouds, and the darkness felt alive. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Behind him, through the fog that curled along the shore, Henry sensed them, the drowned ones, waiting in the shadows. He had seen their pale faces in the water as he rowed out from the harbor, their hollow eyes watching, their silent hunger pulling at his every step. But now, they lingered at the edges of his vision, lurking just beyond the reach of the flickering lantern he carried. The spot Jonas had told him about was here, this desolate, forgotten place where the Harbinger had gone down. The shipwreck was long buried beneath the waves, its bones claimed by the sea, but the curse of the Black Pearl remained, tied to this forsaken stretch of coastline. The water here seemed to churn differently, darker, as if something beneath the surface was stirring, waiting for his next move. Henry's pulse quickened as he stepped closer to the edge, the pearl feeling heavier with each step. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run. But he knew it was too late. The pearl wouldn't let him go now. He had to see this through. The whispers began again, louder now, rising from the depths like a chorus of voices long drowned. They twisted through his mind, pulling at his thoughts, distorting the world around him. Return it. Return what was stolen. Henry knelt at the cliff's edge, his hands shaking as he held the pearl above the churning water below. The weight of it felt unbearable, like he was holding a piece of the ocean's darkness itself. He could feel the presence of the drowned ones growing closer, their cold, wet breath on the back of his neck. The wind howled around him, a low moan that seemed to carry their voices. For a moment, Henry hesitated. The thought of throwing the pearl into the sea terrified him in a way he couldn't fully understand. It was as though the pearl didn't just belong to the ocean. It was the ocean, or something ancient within it, something that had waited for centuries to be freed. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw them. The figures of the drowned ones rising from the water, their bodies pale and bloated, their eyes wide and milky. They reached toward him, their mouths open in silent pleas. Their skin was slick with seawater, their limbs limp and boneless, like corpses pulled from the depths. They were close now, so close he could see the seaweed clinging to their arms, their faces twisted in anguish. The pearl in his hand seemed to vibrate with their approach, as though it was eager to return to them. "Give it back!" The voices hissed, louder now, filling the air with a rising crescendo of desperation. With a cry, Henry lifted the pearl above his head and hurled it into the sea. It arced through the air, catching the faintest glimmer of moonlight before plunging into the dark water below. For a moment there was silence. The sea seemed to still, the waves halting in their restless motion. Henry held his breath, waiting, the tension in the air almost unbearable. And then the water exploded in a violent surge. The waves crashed against the cliffs with renewed fury, the ocean roaring as though it had been awakened. Henry staggered back, the force of the wind knocking him to his knees as the sea reached up, towering before him, a wall of black water that seemed alive, hungry. The drowned ones moved within it, their pale hands stretching toward him, their mouths open in silent screams. For a moment, Henry thought he was lost, that the sea would claim him as it had claimed so many before. But then, just as quickly as it had risen, the water began to recede. The figures of the drowned ones slowly dissolved into the mist, their forms melting back into the ocean's depths. The waves calmed, their rage subsiding into gentle laps against the rocks. Henry gasped for breath, his heart racing as he stared out at the dark water. The pearl was gone. The curse, it seemed, had been lifted. The sea had taken what it was owed, and for now, it was satisfied. But as Henry rose shakily to his feet, a deep chill ran through him. The fog still clung to the cliffs, the air heavy with moisture. And in the distance, far out in the blackness, he could swear he saw something moving beneath the surface of the water. Something vast, something watching. He turned away from the cliff, heading back toward the narrow path that led to the town, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The whispers had stopped, the drowned ones gone, but the sense of unease lingered, deep in his bones. The sea had taken the black pearl back, but Henry knew it was only a matter of time before it came for another.